running at 800 metre pace and just feeling relaxed.
Do you think that's something that a lot of people underappreciate, of the importance of relative speed? You know, even for an 800 metre event, where I guess people always associate with doing more volume, but it's like you said, if you can't get around 400 in 50.8, you're going to really struggle on that second 400 to get a decent time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think when you're looking at your coaching program, you just got to look at your event and work out what the event needs, and then tailor your program around that. So, like you said, 144, you have to go through in 51. If you can't run 51, then you're in trouble. But you got to make that 51 as comfortable as possible. Doesn't mean you have to run 45, but you have to be probably running 47, I think, to make 51 feel comfortable. So within 4 seconds. So that's the way I look at any event and think, well, that's what you need. It's funny though, because you look at some of the distance events, and they sometimes close faster than the 800. So sometimes a 1500 or a 5K is one with a 52 last lap. Yeah. And the 800 is one with a 53 last lap.
I just remember when, I think it was Mo Farah, but also I think Bakila used to do the same thing. They'd do a 10K and they'd run the last lap in 52, 53. And you'd be thinking, like, how the fuck are they pulling that off?
I guess that's when it starts to become much more tactical from 1500 onwards.
Oh, they're so aerobically fit that they might be able to run close to their 400 metre max towards the end of a race. But if you're an athlete and you think, well, I can only run 55, I can't run 1500s, I better move up. But don't move up because you're in trouble, because they're going to close quicker than they would in a 1500. So always look at your event and then make sure you've got the tools to cope with that event, because moving up's not always the answer. I know I said that before for the 200 and 400 guys, but it's not always the answer. But you've got to be mindful of what's...
Yeah, I think interestingly, like, as you know, an athlete that I coach is now with you, which I'm really excited about, and hopefully it works out for both of you. But I found coaching 800s really different to coaching shorter events. So much so that I don't even know that a lot of what you do as you go up actually transfers back the other way. Because so much of it is very much, you're thinking very much about physiology. Whereas as you go down, it's much more thinking about things like biomechanics, technical issues.
Determinants of maximal speed, basically.
Yeah, and you're starting to look at very, very different features. And so much of it's so skill related that things like volumes and trying to develop those things are not what you're trying to work on. Those things almost, in some ways, almost become irrelevant, which is kind of a really counterintuitive if you have done, say, for instance, formal education in sports science, whatever. A lot of these models are based around concepts that are taught for energy system development, because that was where the science was. And it's really interesting. I've noticed this, and I think it's cool that you don't really subscribe to this concept of having a lot of formal education. You kind of just experimented a lot yourself, because coaches are probably around your era and older, right? Because you're close to 50. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm 50. Thanks for reminding me.
You look great, mate. Don't worry.
Thanks.
But of your era and older, particularly if they did formal education, the science at the time was so heavily entrenched in concepts around things like energy systems, because I think that's what they could measure at the time, that they view everything through that lens. And I don't know whether have you noticed
definitely.
And so like, oh, well, that's tapping this system and that's doing this. And you're like, I'm not even thinking, as a sprint coach, I'm not even thinking about, but for distance, it makes sense, right? And particularly middle distance up, it makes perfect sense, because those features are probably bigger drivers of performance. When you go down, and early on when I started coaching, I'd be having conversations with people. You're trying to learn, as you said, from these people, and they're saying these things, and I'm like, I just don't see how that has anything to do with them running faster. And they'd be like, oh, yeah, well, they need to get fitter. And it's like, I don't think they do.
In what way? Like, can you give an example?
Well, there's a lot of programs. If you look at, or a perfect example is someone, like if you're a 400 meter coach, but even 200 meter coach, people would know the name Clyde Hart. Right? And his concept of coaching 400s is to train you, I think, almost like an 800 meter runner.
Yeah, definitely. Plus. I mean, that program is definitely 800 meter based.
Yeah, well, they're doing mile repeats in the winter and stuff like that, almost similar to what you're doing, right? So it's similar to that 800 meter type training. And there were coaches that would use that kind of stuff here. But it's exactly like you said, he's got athletes who naturally they can run, 20 flat. He's got Michael Johnson. If he can keep him healthy and he can keep him fit, the guy can run 19s. So it's not that big of a deal when he puts that kind of work into him. We get someone who starts out and they're running 22 seconds.
Yeah.
They're not going to get faster. They're going to get slower.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's a really hard concept, I think, for people to get grasp of, because in their mind, they do have that sort of model of energy systems. And the cool thing, I don't know how much you've been following, but it sounds like, based on maybe some of the discussions you had with Steve and implementing some of that stuff with Dan Pfaff, that really started to change, I think, probably from 2000s onwards, but, you know, ideas around biomechanics and sprinting really took off.
Yep.
And became so much less about that. So I just find it interesting that for you kind of attacked it more from almost like a needs analysis